The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Hi, I'm Kate Dudding, and I'm a storyteller. Welcome to Story by Story, celebrating the human spirit. Joe Doolittle, my partner in these shows and in many other things, but we're married, but not to each other. He couldn't make it today. But I'm glad that you have. At this point in the show, Joe usually asks me, what have you participated in storytelling that was interesting in the past month? And clearly the answer for last month was the 25th anniversary of the Interfaith Story Circle that was started by my dear friend Gert Johnson 25 years ago. The first meeting had 3 people, including Gert. But this 25th anniversary had 50 people. And they shared memories of storytelling events sponsored by the Interfaith Story Circle, also events from Children at the Well, which was a spin-off or a sister program to the Interfaith Story Circle. Children at the Well, youth storytellers for peace and understanding. I shared a story of how I had an epiphany at a mosque. I was at the mosque because of an Interfaith Story Circle meeting. And I realized that, well, I had always assumed whenever I heard years ago that Muslims prayed 5 times a day, that it had to be quick. If you did it 5 times a day, heck. That was jumping to a huge wrong conclusion. But as part of this Interfaith Story Circle, we went to the sanctuary for their evening prayer service. And we were invited, and I thought, sure, I've never done this, and besides, it'll be quick. Well, it wasn't quick. It was like 10 minutes. And I realized, oh my goodness, if these people do this 5 times a day, and it's not like they do it by the clock, they do it by the sun, so each day it's a different time, each of those changes by a minute or 2. It's like their whole day revolves around this. And I jumped to a conclusion, but it was a better jump this time, that if you were an observant Muslim, you can't be a terrorist. It just didn't seem reasonable that somebody would go, oh, look at the time, it's time to pray, I'll finish this bomb later. You can't pray 5 times a day and go out and destroy people. And I found corroboration from both Time magazine and the Dalai Lama on that. So, anyways, so that's what I did that was interesting and actually fabulous. And the Interfaith Story Circle is going on. It's now, they've created a parent organization for those 2 programs called withourvoice.org. And there'll be a final meeting of this season of the Interfaith Story Circle, and I'll tell you about that later. But today we have with us a storyteller from Cambridge?
Greenwich.
From Greenwich, Kelvin Keraga. Welcome, Kelvin.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. I've heard you often tell with Siri Allison, who has been in that seat, and at the Word Plays up in Salem, and I think word play, a celebration in Proctor's.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
I've done that.
Yes. And I was mentioning to my husband, I'm doing this tomorrow, and my guest is Kelvin Keraga. He goes, the tall fellow tells me, oh, him. Yeah, Kelvin is really good. But
thank you.
You have a job with New York State.
Right.
as a supervisor in energy?
Yeah, I work for NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and I'm the technical services manager for residential homes. I oversee the technical aspects of insulating and doing work like that for the families we serve through the program.
Okay. So that seems to have nothing to do with storytelling. So how did you get involved in storytelling?
Well, actually, my background was acting. I acted in Boston and San Francisco and New York for a bit.
And I did when I Googled your name, you had parts in 2 movies.
Yeah, some real low budget movies. I did a couple of them. It was kind of fun. I got into acting because I really love doing characters, and I feel like I have this inclination to kind of inhabit different people and perform them. Some of my idols were people like Laurence Olivier, who was amazing at transforming into different characters every time he performed, and that's the kind of acting I wanted to do. And I had some opportunities in Boston, especially, to do very different kinds of roles all the time. When I moved to New York, though, it was kind of like people would say, "Just be yourself. Just be yourself." A guy in his 30s, be yourself, and it wasn't as interesting to me, and I wasn't really making it the way I wanted to. So then I got inspired to do this work, which has been my life work and my passion. And I walked away from acting, and I never regretted it. I just love what I do, and it's just very, very, very fulfilling. And I work with a great team of people who do this work and are dedicated to it. So it's been a great mission in my life. But about 23 years ago, at Hubbard Hall up in Cambridge, which is a place that I perform at, we started doing an event called the Community Holiday Breakfast. And every year we focus on a different culture or country, like Spain or France. And last year we actually did Jerusalem, and we focused on just the city and the 3 different great religions that honor that place. But about 2 or 3 years into it, I came up with this idea. Oh, my role in that, by the way, is I'm the MC. I kind of introduce things. I explain the cultures of the place. I introduce we have singers and dancers and kids from the dance schools and stuff like that performing. Great fun. It's a really fun event. But I got interested in maybe doing a story every year, and I started making it a goal to find stories typically related to the holidays or the change of season from cultures that maybe weren't so well known, and kind of started researching old stories and performing them. And I really like that. I like storytelling because you're not relying on a director to come up with a part for you to maybe get to do, where you have to wait for a part to come along and hope you're the one they pick. Instead, I just say, I'd like to tell this.
You are the director. You are the writer.
Yes, and of course that creates a really big responsibility, because when you're working alone, you really have to make sure you're doing something that's worth the audience's time. You really have to consult with people and really honor the fact that the story's not really finished until the audience is there. And it's really, even if they don't pay anything, they're still donating their time and their energy to being in the room, so you really owe it to them. So with storytelling, I think you have to be a little bit more extra careful to make sure that what you do is worth the audience's time. But the wonderful freedom, as you know, is you find the stories and invent, rewrite, whatever you feel is appropriate to do. And for me, I like to kind of inhabit the characters as I perform.
You do that very well.
Well, thank you, thank you. And it gives me a chance to kind of play roles I would never even be cast in, quite frankly.
You're too tall for that.
I'm too tall, and I'm kind of a little older than some of the characters I would like to play.
Well,
Time has passed.
I don't know if you know Tom Weekly.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I saw him tell a story in the first person as a 5-year-old little girl.
Yeah, he's a wonderful storyteller. He is just great.
And it took a moment to go, beard, ignore the beard. Very poignant story that he found on his knees in the children's section of the library.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Last week my brother Anthony died, I think is the story.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. So, anyways, sorry. So you inhabit your characters, even though you wouldn't have typically been cast as that.
Yeah, and you know, my stories come more out of an acting background, and I watch people like Barbara Shapaitis, for example, who just engages the audience and interacts a great deal. I'm more kind of a performance storyteller, at least generally. When I do the stuff at Hubbard Hall, it's a little different, but most of my stories are more kind of performance pieces I write. And very often I like to do them in character. I like to try to find first-person stories because I like the immediacy of playing a character and having a character talk to the audience on stage. So that's generally the way I work.
So you're on the sort of the acting, storytelling kind of has a broad range, and some people are in the acting spectrum. I guess there are several dimensions. Some people love props. Some people hate props. I think it's what the teller prefers, and as long as it's serving the story.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I talked to a storyteller who said to her it's very important to not be in the story, to be telling the story, but be outside the story. And that's great. And then there are people who do stories about themselves and tell their personal lives and do it very wonderfully, you know. So to me, it's a little like music, you know. There are people who play acoustic guitar, there are people that sing a cappella, there are people that have great big synthesized, orchestrated work, and it's all good. It's all different ways to do it.
And in my work of telling stories of real people who made a difference, finding their words to me is really key. It opens up who they are. Yes. That the father of Standard Time, Charles Ferdinand Dowd, was the head of the Temple Grove Ladies Seminary in Saratoga.
No kidding.
But he thought it was stupid and ridiculous and just awful that there was no standard time. When railroads came to be, it didn't matter before the railroads. You know, it's about noon. Seems to be as high. The sun is as high as it's going to be. But once railroads came to be, there were schedules. And very important if there was only one line and trains went both ways on it. Yeah. But also schedules for people to catch the train. And in Albany, there were 4 clocks set to local time for Albany, local time for New York, because some of the trains that went through there, all the train companies decided what local time they were going to use for their standard. That ended up with 800 different standards. And there were trains with 3 different standards going through Albany: New York time, Buffalo time, and Boston time. And people had to keep track of all that kind of stuff. So he had nothing to do with that, but he just thought it was ridiculous, and he came up with the idea of time zones. And then he had to persuade people. But anyways, the railroads standardized in 1883 on November 18th, I think it was. And I thought, gee, if the Saratogian existed then, and I were the editor, I would have sent somebody out to talk to Charles Ferdinand Dowd, to interview him on that day or the day after. And son of a gun, that was all true. And the article had, it was just question and answer, which is just what I wanted. Excuse me, not at all typical newspaper article that you find today. And the last question was, did you receive any pecuniary pecuniary support for your work? Did you get paid for this? And he said, no, except for when I sold my brochures describing it. But for me, it was a labor con amore. And that wasn't even translated in the newspaper, a labor of love. And I'm pleased that this problem has been solved in my own time. So, clearly, I mean, you know, he's a modest guy. he's not, well, I've been telling I told the railroads for years they should be doing it, and finally they came to the right conclusion. That wasn't him at all.
Yeah.
So the words.
Well, you're so right about that, because the thing is, when you do a historical person, it's just so important to try to get their personality right. And when you get their words and you get every clue to who they really are, it's so much better than when somebody gets inflated and distorted into something that is more reflective of the people doing the performance than the real person.
Yeah.
Right?
I love Broadway, but Annie Get Your Gun doesn't really have anything to do with the real Annie Oakley. I mean, she did marry Frank Butler. They were both sharpshooters, but they didn't compete. They only competed against each other once. And then he spent several years wooing her by writing to her, including poems.
Wow.
So
anyways. That reminds me of I just saw Birdman of Alcatraz recently, which is a wonderful movie with Burt Lancaster. But I read afterwards that when some of the other convicts who'd been in prison with the character whose name escapes me, they laughed. They said he was so different and so much more brutal, actually, than the character in the movie. They just laughed when they saw the movie because it was so different.
Yeah. Oh,
good movie,
well.
though.
Good movie. Inspired by.
Inspired by.
Yes.
Inspired by. That's the word.
Okay. So could you inspire us with a story? I know you've come with two.
Yep. One is one of the stories I told at Hubbard Hall during the Iceland, when we did Iceland as a holiday. This is a story that's freely adapted, I have to say, from a story from Iceland. There was a man named John Arneson who was a museum curator and teacher and a custodian too, but he gathered all folk tales from around Iceland. And he was kind of the Hans Christian Andersen of Iceland, and is attributed to having collected these great old stories. So this one I adapted from a couple of the stories, which I think had a common root, and then separated out into different stories, and I brought elements of them together and added my own stuff and a few things. It's called The Hidden Woman, and it goes like this. When Arnur came of age at the farm at the Rotteful in Iceland, he was given the task of guarding the sheep out on the green, grassy Icelandic plains. He loved the landscape. He loved to lie back and look up at the sun and the moon and the stars and just marvel at the mystery of life. But he was a friendly guy, too, and he befriended everybody with an easy manner, open smile. There was, however, one woman with whom he found it difficult to engage conversation. Her name was Una, and she was a very short, very thin woman with a pale, pretty face and sad blue eyes. She had come to the farm 3 years before to help with the raking, and rake seemed like it was touched by magic. She quickly did more work than anyone else. The farmer, whose name was Gare, took a liking to her and brought her in to manage the affairs of the farm. She always treated people with great respect, but always with this kind of distance. The young man Arnur would have accepted her somewhat distant friendship for what it was and let it go at that, except for the dreams. Every night on Christmas Eve, he would have the same dream. He would dream that he was floating and yet bound, that he was with friends who were enemies, that he was in a celebration but with great sadness, tears. He knew that these dreams had something to do with Una, but he knew not what. Well, this particular Christmas Eve, he decided to try to find out. He went to bed and lay awake in his bedclothes, feigning slumber. Now, this wasn't easy to do for a young man who'd been working in the fields all day, but he managed to pull it off. And that night, in the middle of the night, his door creaked open, and Una came into the room. She was carrying this strange bridle, like a horse's bridle. She walked over to the bed, climbed on his back, put the bridle over his head, tugged the reins, and he was lifted up and off and floated over the bed. The great window on the wall opened up, and they glided out into the Icelandic night. It was cold, but he was perfectly comfortable. She tugged the reins and turned him, and they headed west across Iceland. And as they glided along, and he could look down and see the roads winding through the hills like string around bales of hay. In the windows of the houses, he could see the faint flicker of late-night hearths. And in the distance, he could see the misted lens of the ocean. They glided along for a long time until she drew him to a mountain on the far west of Iceland, and she landed him in a barren upland reach next to a deep, steep ravine. She climbed off his back, went over the side of the ravine, and disappeared. Well, he tried to get up, but he found he couldn't move his arms and legs with the bridle on, but he managed to shake it off with his head and climbed up and looked down the ravine. And he saw that there was a set of little ancient stone steps going down into the ravine. And he could see Una down in the distance descending. Well, he started to follow her, but he kept his distance just in case she turned around. But she never did. And the two of them descended down into the bottom of the ravine. When he got there, he was startled to find himself in the middle of a strange little village. There were stone pathways leading through fruit orchards. And on the walls of the ravine, there were birch wood doors leading to cave dwellings. And up on the walls, he could see these tapestries with intricate designs of the sun and the moon and the stars and other shapes too, strange, beautiful shapes he'd never seen before. He was following Una, and he saw that she was heading towards a great big circle in the center of the village with a long table, and all the villagers clustered around it. So he slipped his way around behind some houses and some bushes until he found a rock near the table where he could watch everything close up. And when he got there, he saw that this was a village of the Holdu folk, the people that we call the elves. Now, long ago, his mother had told him about the elves. She said that it was said that in the Garden of Eden, Eve had been washing her children when God called them forth to be seen by him. Well, she hadn't finished washing them all, so she only brought forth the ones for God to see that were cleaned. The other ones, unseen by God, were condemned to live their lives under rocks, in caves, and in distant villages far away from their cousins, the humans, who grew to look on the elves with suspicion and mistrust. Here was a very gathering of those folks. And he could see on the table, he could see leaf bread and mutton stew. And he saw that this was a celebration of the Yule, of the great turning of the wheel of time that's celebrated during the holiday season. Well, now as Una approached the table, all of the townspeople stopped to look and stared at her. And then one stocky, bearded young elf walked up to her and put his arms around her and said, "Wife, it is so good to have you home again." And two little elves came up, and the four of them wrapped their arms around each other and embraced while the rest of the town looked on. The one exception to all this was a wizened old woman with yellow skin and crooked teeth who was tearing mutton off of a bone and eating and completely ignoring Una's arrival. But now, Una's husband took Una by the hand and led her over to the woman and said, "Mother," he said, "we understand your anger for us for getting married without your consent. And we understand that is why you condemned and put a curse on Una that she should live among humans for all of the year and only return to us for 1 night during the Yule. But she has suffered enough. The children have suffered enough. Mother, it is time for you to end this curse and let Una return to us for good." The old woman didn't even look up. "Why, son," she said, "Una knows, and you know, that she has the power to release herself from this curse. All she has to do is live among humans and be accepted by them, and the curse is lifted." I have lived among humans for 3 years, said Una, and they have accepted me well enough.
Yes, but as a Huldufolk? As an elf? Do they know what you really are? Have they accepted you as such?
Ger is a very religious man, said Una. He would never accept me. His family wouldn't accept me as an elf. He might have me imprisoned or worse. I would never see my children again.
Well, said the old woman, you have chosen your fate, and there is nothing more that I can do about it.
And she tossed away the bone, hitting the very rock behind which Arnor was hiding. Una looked at the old woman for a moment, and then she turned to her children and said, "Come, children, let us play while there's still time." Arnor decided not to follow the family as they went off to have some time for themselves, but stayed behind the rock and watched the feast. And then he saw then the sadness in the corners of everybody's eyes. One handsome young elf stood up and sang a beautiful, sweet elven song, and everyone was moved to tears. And then Arnor decided that he'd better go back up in case Una would return and find him missing. So he decided to leave. But before he did, he reached over and grabbed the bone and put it in his pocket. And then he worked his way through the streets and climbed the stairs and went up and put the bridle over his head and waited for her to return. All too soon, Una trudged up the stairs slowly, climbed on his back, tugged the reins, and they glided off eastward across Iceland. She glided him into his window, landed him on his bed, took the bridle off, and she was just about to leave the room when Arnor jumped up and went, "Oh, Una, oh," he said, "Oh, I had such a strange dream. I dreamed that I was in a village of the Huldufolk, and I dreamed that you were one of them." "Well," said Una, "we cannot ever account for the strange imaginings that our dreams give us." "No," said Arnor, "no, and I would pay it no mind at all, except that you are in my room, and I have this in my pocket." And he pulled out the bone. "Well, now you know," said Una. "I'm sorry to have used you in such a way, but surely you see I have no choice. Ger is a very good man, but he's so religious. He and his family would never accept me for what I am. And so I am resigned to live the life that I am condemned to live." Arnor thought about it for a moment, and he said, "You know, Una, when that old woman made her curse, I don't believe she said how many humans must accept you. So it seems to me one lone man will do. When I first met you, I accepted you as a friend. When you kept your distance from me, I accepted you as a friend that was a kind of a wounded bird. But now that I saw what I saw, and I know what I know, I accept you as a friend and as a Huldufolk. So, you see, Una, the curse you were under has already been lifted. Go home. Go home to your family." Una looked at him for a moment, and then her pinched, drawn face broke open to this great big smile. It was for Arnor, it was the most magical thing he'd seen all night. "Thank you, Arnor, thank you," she said. "And listen, Arnor," she said, "soon you will be given the opportunity to change your life. When it comes, take it." And she kissed him lightly on the cheek, and she was gone. Well, in the morning, Ger and his family were surprised and disappointed to find a note from Una indicating that she had left the farm to return to her family and wishing them all a happy Christmas and farewell. Well, that night, there had a great big Christmas feast, and it was for Arnor. It was the most wonderful feast he'd had in a long time. First of all, because he'd solved the riddle of the dreams, but also because he knew that in another place, another kind of people were having their own kind of celebration with their own food and their own songs and their own wishes for a good new year to come. And that for one particular family, that wish was already coming true. And then there came a time a few weeks later when a visiting silversmith came to the farm and invited Arnor to come and apprentice. Well, remembering Una's words, Arnor complied. And over time, he became known throughout Iceland for his beautiful, beautiful silverwork, intricate designs of the sun and the moon and the stars, and other shapes as well, strange, intricate shapes, shapes that were unknown to the mind, but somehow familiar to the heart. Thank you.
That was perfectly splendid.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I was riveted. He's a horse. Well, he's a flying horse, and then this. And that nasty old woman. And,
that was fun to work on, and that was kind of an example to me of where. I feel sometimes it's very important to tell stories exactly like they're written, but other times I think it's better even sometimes to adapt them. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that I think that very often a culture assumes that other people in the culture know the culture, so they don't describe it. So, for example, how many stories you've read where it says the king had a feast? It's a feast, and nobody knows what the food is. So, one of the things I like to do is I say, well, what would somebody eat in that culture? So, in this case, it's leaf bread, which is a kind of a bread made in Iceland, and the doors of the cave are birch wood because that's the predominant wood. So, like fitting those kind of details into the story in a way that brings the culture more to life, I think is a real important thing to do.
And giving it the context.
Giving it the context.
That, as you said, everyone there knows, so it's not part of their story.
Right.
But that outsiders need to really understand.
No, that's right. And then stories are, there's the difference between a written story and a performance story. And a written story, you can do things where the audience has time to think, but you can't do that in performance. If you do something that has a complex concept that people start having to figure it out, then they're not listening anymore. They're going, well, what is that? Oh, what's the implication of that? So, and then of course there are things like you don't necessarily always have to say, he said angrily.
Oh,
you
right,
can just
right,
say it
right.
angrily.
Right, exactly. That's like, no, you're following the text too closely.
Yeah. So you can drop that stuff off and create it through your performance, So that's important too. And then of course a lot of stories are translated anyway. And in this case, that story came from two stories, one of which was called Una the Elf Woman. And I didn't want to give away what was going on by calling it that or using that up front.
Sometimes I have two titles.
Yeah.
The one for the program and the one that really says it to me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's great to do it both ways, but it's fun to choose those things. And I think that if you look, of course, you probably know the Cinderella movement, where I think somebody has recorded over 300 different versions of Cinderella, and I think that's a wonderful reflection on storytellers' ability to improvise and bring something into the culture and make it their own rather than just telling it exactly like it's written.
Now, did you ever hear the story about Cinderella and the glass slippers? Oh, well, there is a story floating around that it really wasn't, they weren't glass slippers, they were fur slippers. And the word for glass and fur in French are quite close. And when it was translated, it was mistranslated.
No kidding.
That is just a story, however, because I went to a talk at the Clark Art Museum on some of their books, and it was on books on folk and fairy tale. So I said, oh yeah, I'd like to go see that. And I have held in these two hands a book of Charles Perrault, published in 1685.
Wow.
And so, and I was a French major, so I'm flipping to Cinderella and going, the slippers, and it is the word there for glass. So what that disagrees with that story. So then I went to Snopes.com and found out that yes, that was a story, but as far as they've figured out is that Perrault added that it was glass slippers, that it hadn't been glass slippers previously, and that he added the glass slippers.
You mean he added after they discovered there was a
No,
word?
no, that was part of the story that he added. That it was just, she dropped her slipper. And that was what it was prior to him writing it down. And he thought, making a glass slipper would be even cooler.
Yeah.
So
did he write the story originally, or was it?
No,
he adapted it.
He adapted it. Yes.
Okay.
So
Well, there you go. There's a wonderful example of a writer, storyteller adding something that's become such an iconic image. You know, the glass slipper is it's a great image that wouldn't be there if he hadn't indulged in doing that.
Except I take dance lessons twice a week.
Yeah, well, there's that.
Those are not really what you want to dance in. Tap shoes have split soles, a sole for the ball of your foot and a sole for the heel, and there's nothing in between to make the shoe more flexible. So the glass slipper is the antithesis of all that.
Well, maybe he would have said Mylar if it existed at the time.
Yeah. Right.
No.
But shiny. Anyways, we digress, and we have more important things to do. Okay, so now I talk about coming events. And I happen to be in the first coming event. The first Tuesday in June is June 5th. Joe Doolittle, my absent partner, hosts First Tuesday's Tales and Stuffs at Arthur's Market and Historic Coffee House in the Stockade section of Schenectady. I will be the featured performer there on June 5th, and my topic is acts of kindness. So you're invited to come. It's an open mic for storytelling, music, and spoken word. And join in the theme or bring something else. That starts at 7. Sign up is at 6:45. Then, someplace you've also been, the Saratoga Storytelling Open Mic.
Oh, yes.
In June is on, as always, right now, the second Wednesday of the month. That's June 13th, 7 p.m. It will be at Woodlawn Commons, which is in the Harkness building of the Wesley Community on Clement Street. It's behind Hospice. And you're welcome to come as a listener or as a teller. Again, sign up is at 6:45 if you want to tell. Then, as I mentioned earlier, the Interfaith Story Circle has a meeting in June also. Thursday, June 14th, 7 to 9 p.m. More stories from the LGBTQ community. They had a program last year that was very well received and attended, and so they're having it again at this time at the First Lutheran Church, ELCA of Albany. And their theme for their 25th anniversary year was the power of story. And so this is the last one in that series. They take July and August off. But their website, as you can see, is withourvoice.org/IFSC, Interfaith Story Circle. I'm their volunteer webmaster. Then I thought I'd mention that downstate from here is the Clearwater Festival, and they have a story grove. It's mostly folk music, but Jerry Burns and Barry Marshall, who have been here, the Story Crafters, have been hosting the Story Grove for, I think, at least 20 years. And they will be telling, Alan McClintock will be there, Mary Murphy, who has been there.
Mary, yes.
Jim Bruchak, we've had Jim's brother Jesse and father Joe, but I saw his picture was there, and other wonderful storytellers. So that's June 16th and 17th, Croton-on-Hudson. You can take the train down, and it's an easy walk from the train station over to where they have the festival. The next Story Circle meeting is on Wednesday, June 20th at the Pine Hills Branch Library in Albany. We share stories under development. We had a meeting here at the Colonie Town Library recently, and I shared a story, which I'm preparing for the LGBTQ storytelling in June of the Interfaith Story Circle. I came upon this story, and I went about a remarkable woman doing work during the AIDS crisis in Tennessee. And I thought, oh, that fits. And, and I can add it to my pool of acts of kindness stories. So I'll probably tell that at Arthur's also. So you can come if you have a story you want to share. Please, we don't read the stories, we tell them. Or you can come and listen. Then, this is a coming attraction for July. Up at Weowaka Center for Women on the east side of Lake George, they're having a week of Georgia O'Keeffe programs. And two of us from Story Circle are participating in that. I will be telling stories on Sunday night, July 8th at 7 p.m. about Georgia O'Keeffe, her home, and her art. One story is going to be about, I'm working on that right now, my visit to her home in Abiquiu. This was the second home she bought north of Santa Fe, and she bought it because it had a garden, and she wanted fresh vegetables. She was quite a healthy eater, especially for somebody in the 30s. And you can see how her home, she did a lot of paintings of her home and of the surrounding areas. So that was very exciting, the visit that I took several years ago. And then I will give my program, Georgia O'Keeffe in her own words. She published a book in 1976, it's a wonderful book that has a reproduction of a painting and then her telling about the painting and what inspired her. So it's as if she's giving you a tour. I'm still talking as me, but I'm using her words. Then on Wednesday of that week, Claire Nolan will be impersonating Georgia O'Keeffe and telling about Georgia O'Keeffe's life through stories and pictures. So that's a coming attraction, and we always like to mention we have over 200 stories on demand via our website and YouTube. You can easily find it by going to storycircle@proctors.org and click on YouTube, and that's where you'll find this program. And Kelvin's stories will be cut. Well, you can start them. I'll put a link up so that you'll just start at the beginning of his two stories.
Great.
So we have we're at 43 minutes out of 58. So we have just time for your 15-minute story.
Great. This is Ghost Story. This is a story I wrote myself. And it's done in character, and it's called The Key. And it goes like this. A cold rain was falling and freezing into an icy grit as soon as it hit the pavement. There was just enough traction for driving, but just enough. I was drowsy when I left the lumberyard back where I worked, but a few miles back, my car had fishtailed, the rear end swinging into the icy ridge at the center line and then swinging over to the dirty sludge on the side of the road before I managed to straighten it out. After that, I was wide-eyed and white-knuckled, all my concentration going into the feeling of the steering wheel and the feeling of the tires on the road. It was way too early in the storm for any sand trucks. I had to get home before the road iced up entirely. There had already been enough wreckage on this stretch of highway for one season. Masterson Road's a pretty empty stretch of highway. Aren't too many farms or businesses on it, but about halfway home I passed the Pioneer Tavern. Smitty's place to us locals. I just kept going, though I didn't go in. I hadn't been in since that night 3 weeks before when I did something I figured cost the life of my neighbor Ralph. Smitty's had been about half crowded that night. There was some kind of hopeless Knicks game going on 3 of the big wide screens and some poker thing on the other one. Ralph and I were sitting at a corner table. I was nursing a dark beer. He was knocking down highballs, big tall glasses with ripples on the sides. On the table in front of us was the key to his pickup truck. It was a big old Chevy key on a chain with a couple of pink dice. He was going on about his wife, how Helena shouldn't have been driving the truck that day, how she shouldn't be driving the truck at all, how women were terrible drivers in general. Truck was an old bare bones pickup from back in the day when trucks were just good, solid workhorses instead of the expensive mobile offices they become today. It had belonged to his son Wesley. Wesley had banged out all the dents, puttied it up, painted it baby blue, put a little bit of white trim on the corner fenders, put in leather upholstery and a big chrome gear shift and a big old Hemi engine too. Wesley did all this when he was a teenager. And then Wesley went away to Iraq, came back in a box. After that, Ralph took to driving the pickup truck himself. Took to drinking heavily, too. Well, that night as he went on about his wife, I knew enough to keep quiet about it. I knew that she was the one in the family with no points on her license. Besides, I knew that this whole talk about who gets to drive the truck was just some kind of realignment after the death of their son. It spoke of guilt and anger and recriminations that I wasn't in any position to judge. It's kind of like listening to an argument in a foreign language, except I was only hearing half the argument, and that was Ralph, and he was drunk. Well, something must have happened in the Knicks game because this old farmer named Rex, who was sitting at a bar a stool at the bar, started screaming obscenities at the TV screen. Well, Ralph pulled his chair back and turned around to see what was going on and knocked over his drink, and whiskey and ice spilled all over the table. So I jumped up and I grabbed the key to get it out of the way and some napkins. I started cleaning up. Ralph pushed back and bumped into a big burly guy in a green T-shirt I'd never seen before, who glared at both of us. And Ralph looked down at his wet lap and he said, "Well, I guess that about does it for me. Now where is that key?" I held it up and I said, "I think I better drive you home, cowboy." "Drive me home," he says. "I don't need you to drive me home. I got my son's pickup truck. Now give me the key." "I'm going to keep you out of trouble," I said. "Keep me out of trouble," he says. "You're going to get me in trouble. Now give me the key. Give me the goddamn key." Heads were turning. I was tired. I mean, he'd done the ride 100 times. I held the key and I squeezed the dice for a minute. And then I handed it over to him. "Be careful," I says. "Always," he says. Well, I figured I'd leave too, drive along with him, keep my eye on him as he's going home. But then he headed over to the bar for another round. And I just left in disgust. Masterson Road follows this valley, the railroad grade for a while, and then it curves up through the hills up to the little village where Ralph and I both lived. About 200 yards up, it makes a sharp right turn in the face of a wall of shale. Ralph wasn't the first person to miss that turn, but the history of bad decisions didn't matter. He was still just as dead when his pickup truck smashed into the wall. truck was still smoking when the EMT guys got there and realized there wasn't any point in hurrying any longer. Must have been hard for them. They were friends of Wesley's. They'd known Ralph all their life. But they kept it out of their voices when they told me about it the next day. Kept it out of their voices, but not out of their eyes. I felt a kinship for them, you know. I felt, I guess, what a lot of family members and friends feel when an alcoholic dies that way. You know, you feel like that there's one thing, one goddamn thing you could have done to stop it. Except I was blessed and cursed with knowing what I thought it was. I could have kept that key, I thought. And Ralph would still be alive today. Well, now on this night, 3 weeks later, I felt the rear end of my car swing a little bit again, and I realized there was no room in my mind for these recriminations that had been cycling through my head for the last 3 weeks. I just had to keep my mind on my driving. Well, the road had been empty up until then, but now I saw a couple of headlights in the rearview mirror coming up behind me, swaying slightly, driving too fast, coming up behind me too quick. Well, I resisted the urge to speed up, and I started looking for a place to maybe pull over. The side of the road was kind of dropped off gradually. It was doable, but I might get stuck. I looked behind me again. The headlights were coming up real fast. There was no choice, so I turned the wheel. But I must have turned it too quickly because suddenly my car fishtailed around again, the rear end swinging into the oncoming lanes. I felt this surge of hopeless panic as my car spun around like a carnival ride and then jerked to a stop. I was sideways across the road. I looked out my driver's side window and I could see the headlights bearing down on me. There was no time to get out of the way. I froze. And then in the last second before impact, I saw that it was the baby blue pickup with Ralph at the wheel. And then he was passing through me like a cold wind and a deep pang of regret. And then outside my passenger window, I saw the lights blink once and then drive off in the distance and disappear around the curve. All this before I knew none of this could have happened. I just kind of went out of myself for a minute. And then when I came around, I realized my feet were still pressed down on the brake and the clutch. I turned the key and the engine made a little scritch and I realized it was still running. Pulled the car over the side of the road and just sat for a minute. I felt like I was in the moment right after I gave Ralph the key. I felt like I just wanted to just go back a minute. Go back in the moment before I gave it to him. But I couldn't. Too late. I got on the car and got on the road again and started driving again. I began to wonder if Ralph would be waiting for me up at that curve in the road. I kind of knew that he would be. And sure enough, when I got to the curve, there was the ghost of the baby blue pickup truck smashed into the wall of shale. Well, I got out of the car, walked over to take a closer look. The ghost of that wreckage was brutally real. The hood was all folded up and you could see bits of shale caught in the creases. The fenders were chipped and Bondo was showing through. Windshield was bloody spider web. Passenger window was completely gone. So I went over and I looked in. And there was Ralph. His back to me, he's hunched over, a big reddish-brown stain on his denim coat. I just stared at him, waiting to see what would happen. You know, would he ask me why I gave him the key? Would he scream at me? Would he yell at me? Would he laugh? I mean, what the hell does it matter what he does anyway? He was a drunk. What the hell does it matter what a drunk does? It mattered to me, though. But the ghost of the corpse just remained silent and still. And then I noticed something. In the dim light on the floor below the passenger seat, I could see the Chevy key on the chain with the pink dice. So I looked in the ignition, and there was another key on a ring with 7 or 8 other keys and a Harley medallion. I thought about it, and then I realized what had happened. The key on the chain with the pink dice was his wife's key. He said she'd been driving a pickup truck that day. She must have got in, or got out, and he got in without taking it out. That's why he had it that night. But he had his own key, only in his pocket or whatnot. And he would have driven off whether I gave him the key or not. So I didn't kill him. I didn't kill him. And maybe that's why he appeared to me this night, just to let me know it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. I just stood there for a moment, and then I just said, "Thanks, Ralph. Thanks." And then I went back to my car and got in. When I turned around to look again, the ghost of the baby blue pickup truck was gone. Well, the icy rain had turned to snow by now, but I drove real careful the rest of the way home. You know, I think that was probably Ralph's last gift to me, was a demonstration of what could happen if I was reckless with my driving. I thought if I was ever in that situation again, I would hold on to that key no matter what kind of recriminations came to me from across the table. But I guess I also knew that an alcoholic will always find a bottle and a key, and sometimes a wall of shale to smash it into. When I got home, my wife was cooking dinner. Went up the steps into the kitchen and just put my arms around her, and I just held her until she finally realized that I was really and truly home again. Thank you.
Whoa, that was quite a ride.
Thank you.
And that came all out of your brain, huh?
Yeah, I was driving home one night, and there was a pickup truck in front of me, and suddenly it swayed a little bit, and that was the start of it. But you know, there's a John Steinbeck, and maybe you've read this, East of Eden. In the beginning of the book, he does this tribute before the book where he uses the metaphor of calling his novel a box to put things in. And I think that's true of stories too, because I think when I write, I'm sure it's true for you too, it's like things happen to you in your life and you come up with a concept and then you go, ooh, this would be a nice thing to express in the story, you know. So, for example, I was in the canyon area hiking, and I hired a guy to drop me off at the trailhead so I could get to my car and not have to cycle around. And it was this local guy that had an old Chevy pickup he had 300,000 miles on it. It was all rusted and beat up. It was his third engine. But you know, that that memory was one of the things I brought into the story as I started writing. So that's how it worked.
So, unfortunately, we could talk for another hour, at least, but our time is done here. Thank you, Kelvin, for coming.
Oh, it's an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
It was a pleasure. And the community event for learning about around the world, that has already happened this year?
That happens every December in the holidays.
Okay.
First week of December, second week of December is when we do that.
And then Whispering Bones.
Yeah, that's my night of ghost stories at Hubbard Hall, and that takes place about the last week of December.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mixture of stories by various storytellers and actors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for coming, and we hope you come back next time.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. seasoned spinning